How does one write about war without tilting either side of the scale? How do you portray the absence of romanticized chaos without dwelling on the horrors of what remains? For Vonnegut, war is inevitable, however a tragic occurrence of which there is nothing intelligent to be said about. But maybe if you created a character uncharismatic enough to guide readers through the horrid experience, light could be shed and humor could be found in irony. Billy Pilgrim, a POW in Germany, has become unstuck in time, no longer experiencing it in a linear fashion and keeps drifting back and forth from his experience in Dresden to other periods in his lifetime. Somewhere along the line, he gets abducted by extraterrestrials and is put in a zoo on their planet for their entertainment. With the number of eventful things that occur throughout the plot, the story has a lot going for it. War, time travel, aliens, existentialism. A thematically heavy narrative which honestly doesn't need the protagonist to do too much as the events of the story carry their own weight. It's why it's not that much of a letdown when you read the book and realize how dull of a character Billy is. Inactive, bland, sluggish, timid, frail, just an all-round unremarkable person that makes reading things from his perspective a very frustrating task. Slaughterhouse-Five presents a character that stands in the middle of a number of horrific and unusual occurrences and almost never has anything of substance to say. At first I just assumed this to be his personality, then he was abducted by the Tralfamadorians and his nature of refusing to exert control was worsened as it became a conscious thing. The further I got into the book, the more irritated I was with Billy. I was almost always at the brink of audibly yelling at him to do something. But maybe there is a reason for why the character was written to be this way. Billy is not mentally stable, but unlike Nakoshi from the previous video, he's an actual victim of circumstance, non-violent to a fault and the reality of a number of war survivors who probably had glamorous ideals about warfare. It's not expressly stated in the book, but it's heavily implied and of popular belief that Billy is suffering from PTSD. I was much younger the first time I read the book and I was solely interested in the science fiction it promised. Of course, I was disappointed because I expected action and adventure, not philosophy and a screwed up narrative structure. The introduction of the Tralfamadorians was very anticlimactic at the time, but a few years and brain folds later and it dawned on me. The Tralfamadorians aren't real. They never were. After chapter 4 of the book where Billy is abducted, I began to notice few parallels between his captivity in Tralfamadore and his imprisonment in Dresden, as well as a couple of other moments in his life, some parallels more identical than others, so I started to pay more attention, hoping to find links in dialogue or setting or even in the narrative that tied these events together. And there was enough evidence to prove that this wasn't mere coincidence. When Billy is abducted, he asks the question, "Why me?" To which the Tralfamadorians answer, "Why you? Why anything?" The next chapter, Billy watches a German guard assault another American, to which the prisoner asks, "Why me?" And the guard replies, "Why you? Why anybody?" The Serenity Prayer on Billy's office wall conveniently also appears in Montana Wildhack's locket. When Billy arrives in Dresden, he mentions that there is a zoo. Speaking of, in chapter 9, Billy goes to a bookstore in New York where he comes across a book that he had apparently read before about a man and a woman who had been kidnapped by extraterrestrials and put on display in a zoo. A scenario we have become quite familiar with. It's clear to a decent extent that Billy had dragged various pieces of his life and sewn them together to conjure up the illusion of Tralfamadorians in order for him to find some peace in all that he had experienced. I think the crux of understanding Billy's character is encapsulated in the statement made by one of the aliens where it said, "That's one thing Earthlings might learn to do if they tried hard enough. Ignore the awful times and concentrate on the good ones." And this is all Billy does throughout the book. Sometimes I wondered what his present setting in reality was. Are we being told the story of his experience in Dresden while he drifts off into memories to ignore his reality as a prisoner? Or has the war passed and he's living a regular life as an optometrist but constantly drifting back into his experience in the war? Either way, Billy's inability to mentally stay at a place is indicative of his PTSD, a desperate need to constantly cope. Billy gives up control and responsibility over his life, not necessarily because he wants to, but because this is something he probably never felt he had in the first place. He wants to find meaning, he wants there to be a reason for why bad things happen, but that's something that he'll just never get an answer to. There is no why, just bugs trapped in number. There is no use in having the courage to change things when the things he wants to change are out of his hands. So he accepts them, even when this acceptance isn't born from a genuine place. But it doesn't make it any less frustrating. There's the argument that Vonnegut encourages nihilistic thinking in this book, but I disagree. I think he presents a character that does nothing, embodies nothing, and believes nothing as a way to create enough space for readers to walk in his shoes. Sometimes in anime, a protagonist is created to be as dull and soulless as possible, so devoid of a personality that it's easy for audience members to project themselves onto such character and believe that they possess similarities. Nothing gives way for anything to exist. Billy might be an uninspiring character because it's easier for readers to self-insert this way. But unlike anime, there is no definitive plot and you see things strictly from Billy's eyes, so the book almost feels like a simulation. Hence, your reaction to what happens solely depends on who you are as a person, which is probably why the feelings on this book are wildly subjective. Billy's proclivity for doing nothing and feeling nothing gives you space to feel everything. Frustration over Billy's inaction, confusion over the story's narration, the emptiness of war, acceptance or refusal of nihilism, the existential hopelessness of a constructed reality, the irony in so many parts of the story, pity, humor, despair, lack of control. Nothing gives way for everything to be felt. You feel so much as opposed to specific emotions you would feel with linear storytelling, and I think we have to consider this experience when we think of Billy, who probably feels all these emotions to such an overwhelming extent that he simply appears to be numb. 105 times death is mentioned in this book, and yet by the final chapter those 3 words still manage to make the story feel bleak. Even when I thought I had gotten used to it, death happens again, and I may want to ruminate on it this time, but the story swiftly carries on, and the next paragraph is making humor out of the situation, and just like that, for a brief moment, death becomes a thing of the past. And the same thing applies for other not so great things that happen in the story. You want to reach into the book and do something, but just like Billy on his way to Tralfamadore, you are restrained to do nothing but witness the events unfold. But even with this, the book barely takes itself seriously. Vonnegut litters the plot with Easter eggs and dry humor at some point showing up in Billy's story like a Marvel cameo. Though so much objectively goes on in the book, it's written without urgency or danger. Even when we are in Dresden, it's presented like nothing is really happening. No emotion, just a telling of events. And then you finally reach the story's conclusion and you are left with a feeling of emptiness. Nothing is resolved, nothing changes. Everything happens and all that remains is the irony of surviving by being held in a slaughterhouse, a string of so it goes and the birds put to eat. All that time, all that pain, all that death to result in nothing. And despite whatever frustration I had with Billy, I finally came to understand him.